George Cooper was one of the most important people in the Cooper family, but for most of young Sheldon, he was also one of the loneliest. He was the person everyone depended on when something went wrong. When Sheldon needed something, George was there. When Georgie needed direction, George stepped in. When Missy needed someone who actually noticed her, George was there. Even Mary, despite their growing distance, depended on him to keep the family functioning. He was constantly giving something to everyone around him, yet almost nobody stopped to ask what George himself needed. That is what makes his character so heartbreaking. George was the family's power outlet. Everyone was connected to him. Everyone needed something from him. And somehow, he was expected to keep working no matter how exhausted he became. He provided financially, coached football, solved family problems, supported his children's ambitions, protected his wife, and repeatedly sacrificed his own opportunities for the people he loved. But while everyone was taking something from him, very few people were giving anything back emotionally. And the more you look at George's life, the clearer it becomes that his loneliness wasn't caused by one major event. It came from years of being needed without truly being understood. The first part of George's loneliness came from his work. Being a football coach wasn't simply a job where George went to school, coached a team, and came home. He had to deal with teenagers, parents, school administrators, expectations, victories, losses, and the constant pressure that came with being responsible for other people's children. He spent his days managing problems, and when he came home, there was rarely a chance to switch off. Instead, another set of problems was waiting for him. Sheldon needed attention. Georgie needed guidance. Missy needed someone to notice what she was going through. Mary had her own concerns, especially when it came to Sheldon's future and the family's religious life. George could walk through the front door after an exhausting day and immediately become responsible for solving something else. There was almost never a moment when he could simply be George. That helps explain why his beer, television, and backyard became so important to him. From the outside, it was easy to see George sitting with a beer, watching television, or spending time alone outside, and assume that he was simply lazy or uninterested in his family. But there was another way to look at those moments. They were some of the only places where nobody was asking him for anything. His beer wasn't necessarily about escaping responsibility. His television wasn't necessarily about avoiding his family. His backyard wasn't necessarily proof that he didn't care. Sometimes they were simply places where George could breathe. For a man who spent most of his life taking care of other people, having a few moments where nobody needed anything from him was probably one of the closest things he had to peace. And that becomes even more important when you look at George's anger. George could lose his temper. He could become frustrated, defensive, and emotionally overwhelmed. But his anger often felt like something deeper was underneath it. There is a difference between being angry because you don't care and being angry because you care too much and don't know how to express what you're feeling. The idea of don't play angry, play hurt fits George remarkably well. A lot of his anger came from disappointment, exhaustion, fear, and feeling unappreciated. He wasn't simply furious because someone disagreed with him. He was often hurt because he had spent years making sacrifices that he believed his family didn't recognize. He wanted to provide for them. He wanted to protect them. He wanted to give his children opportunities he never had. And yet, when his efforts weren't acknowledged, that hurt had to come out somehow. Unfortunately, George didn't have many people he could talk to about it. That's another major part of his loneliness. George had almost no close friends. His relationships with people like Wilkins and Peterson were mostly connected to work and football. They were people he could interact with, joke with, or discuss coaching with, but that isn't necessarily the same thing as having someone you can sit down with and tell everything to. Look at the other members of the Cooper family. Sheldon had professors, scientists, and eventually an entire academic world waiting for him. Georgie eventually had Mandy. Missy had Paige and other people she could connect with. Mary had her church community, her faith, and eventually Pastor Rob. Meemaw had her own social circle, relationships, and a life outside the Cooper household. George, meanwhile, increasingly found himself standing in the middle of everyone else's lives without having a place of his own. He was the person everyone could turn to. But who could George turn to? That question becomes even more painful when you look at the sacrifices he made for his career. George wasn't simply a man who gave up his ambitions because he lacked ambition. He had opportunities, and several times he made difficult decisions because he believed his family came first. One of the clearest examples was the situation involving illegal player recruitment in Galveston. George did the right thing by reporting it, even though doing so came at a cost. He lost his job and ultimately moved his family to Medford. It was another example of George choosing what he believed was right, even when the consequences made his own life harder. But sacrifices like that rarely came with a celebration. There was no big moment where everyone gathered around George and told him that they understood what he had given up. He simply did it. Then life moved on. The same thing happened with the Tulsa opportunity. George had a chance to improve his career and potentially provide his family with a better future. But moving wasn't something the family wanted. Once again, George put his own ambitions aside. He stayed. He sacrificed. He accepted the decision. And then, years later, another opportunity finally appeared. The Rice opportunity represented something different. It wasn't just another job. It was the possibility of finally reaching the professional future George had spent years working toward. After sacrificing so many opportunities for his family, he finally had something that could give him a sense of personal accomplishment. But George never got to properly enjoy it. He died shortly afterward. That is one of the cruelest parts of his story. George spent years putting his dreams second because his family needed him. Then, just when a major career opportunity finally gave him a chance to put himself first, his life was cut short. And that makes his loneliness even more tragic, because he didn't just lose his career ambitions. He lost the chance to finally experience what all those sacrifices had been for. His marriage also became another source of isolation. George and Mary loved each other, but their relationship became increasingly complicated as the years passed. Mary became deeply invested in religion, Sheldon, and the problems surrounding their family. George often felt as though he was standing on the outside of his own marriage. Mary wasn't necessarily trying to push him away. That's what makes it more complicated. Her attention was constantly being pulled towards Sheldon and the family's problems. Sheldon required special attention because of his intelligence and the challenges he faced. Mary's faith became another major part of her life. Then Pastor Rob entered the picture and gave Mary someone she could talk to emotionally. George watched all of this happen while becoming increasingly disconnected from his wife. And for someone who already had very few close relationships, losing emotional closeness with his wife must have made his loneliness even worse. That's where Brenda becomes important. George's connection with Brenda can easily be viewed only through the question of whether he was going to cheat on Mary. But there is another layer to it. Brenda represented connection. She listened to George. She talked to him. She made him feel noticed at a time when he increasingly felt invisible inside his own marriage. That doesn't make every decision surrounding their relationship right, but it does help explain why George was vulnerable to that connection. He wasn't simply searching for another woman. He was searching for someone who would see him. For years, George had been the person noticing everyone else. He noticed when Missy was being ignored. He noticed when Sheldon needed support. He worried about Georgie. He worried about Mary. But who noticed George? Brenda did. And that is why their interactions carried so much emotional weight. George's loneliness also extended to Sheldon. Ironically, Sheldon may have depended on his father more than he ever realized. George supported Sheldon's ambitions, even when those ambitions created enormous pressure for the entire family. He drove Sheldon where he needed to go. He supported his academic interests. He even drove him to NASA. George repeatedly showed up for his son. But Sheldon didn't always understand what those sacrifices meant. As a child, Sheldon naturally viewed the world through his own perspective. He noticed what people did to him, what they failed to do for him, and how they affected his life. He didn't always have the emotional maturity to understand why his father made certain decisions. That became especially painful when adult Sheldon remembered George primarily through negative stories. The cheating story is the most obvious example. For years, Sheldon believed he had caught his father with another woman. That That memory became one of the darkest parts of his understanding of George. But later, the truth became much more complicated. The woman Sheldon saw was Mary, and George wasn't having an affair. Suddenly, one of the stories that had shaped Sheldon's opinion of his father was no longer what Sheldon believed it had been. And that revelation says something important about George. He wasn't perfect, but he was also never given the credit he deserved. The person who understood George best may have been Missy. Their relationship was different because Missy didn't simply need George to solve something. She appreciated him. George noticed Missy in a way that other members of the family sometimes failed to do. When Mary became consumed with Sheldon's education, George recognized that Missy was quietly slipping through the cracks. He coached her baseball. He encouraged her. He spent time with her. Most importantly, he made her feel seen, and Missy returned that affection. Their relationship was one of the few genuinely two-way emotional connections George had within his immediate family. George gave Missy attention, but Missy also gave George something he rarely received from others: recognition. She understood that he was there. She appreciated what he did. She loved him without needing him to accomplish something first. That's why their relationship becomes so important when looking at George's loneliness. Missy wasn't simply another person who depended on him. She was one of the few people who made him feel valued. There is another part of George's past that adds an additional layer to his isolation: his military experience. George was a Vietnam veteran, yet his experiences from that period were rarely something he openly discussed. Whatever emotional weight came from that part of his life, he largely carried it quietly. That fits the character. George wasn't someone who constantly explained how he felt. He kept moving. He went to work. He coached football. He took care of his family. He drank his beer. He watched television. He went into the backyard. He kept going. And perhaps that was the problem. George became so good at carrying things that everyone assumed he could carry anything. His family became accustomed to him being the stable one. When something needed to be handled, George handled it. When someone needed support, George provided it. When there was a crisis, George stepped forward. But strength can become its own prison. When everyone believes you're strong, they stop asking whether you're tired. That's exactly what happened to George. People loved him, but they didn't always tell him. His coworkers respected him. Missy adored him. His family depended on him. Even Meemaw eventually grew to love and appreciate him. The problem wasn't that George was unloved. The problem was that so much of that love remained unspoken. George spent years assuming responsibility without receiving enough emotional reassurance in return. He didn't need everyone to constantly praise him, but occasionally he needed someone to tell him that what he was doing mattered. He needed someone to say, "I see what you're sacrificing." Instead, he often had to figure it out himself. That makes his death especially painful. George died at the moment when his biggest dream was finally becoming possible. After years of putting his career second, he finally had an opportunity with Rice that could have changed his professional life. He had spent years coaching, sacrificing, moving, compromising, and putting his family's needs ahead of his own. And then, before he could properly enjoy that future, he was gone. His family was left behind to understand everything he had done only after they could no longer thank him for it. That's why George's death doesn't just represent the loss of a father. It represents the loss of the person who had quietly been holding everything together. And perhaps the greatest emotional payoff comes much later, through Sheldon. As Sheldon becomes an adult and eventually becomes a father himself, he gains something he didn't have as a child: perspective. For the first time, he begins to understand what it actually meant to be responsible for a family. He understands what it means to sacrifice your own comfort for someone else. He understands what it means to worry about your children. He understands what it means to keep going even when you're exhausted. And eventually, he begins to understand George. The father Sheldon once remembered primarily through his mistakes becomes, in hindsight, a man who did everything he could. George wasn't perfect. He could be angry. He could be stubborn. He could make bad decisions. He could become frustrated. But none of those things erased the sacrifices he made. He was the family's power outlet. Everyone connected to him because everyone needed something from him. He supplied the energy that kept the household functioning, even when nobody stopped to ask where that energy was coming from. And when he was gone, everyone finally realized how much he had been carrying. That is what makes George Cooper's story so tragic. He wasn't alone alone because nobody loved him. He was alone because the people who loved him were often too busy depending on him to realize that he needed them too. Mary needed him. Sheldon needed him. Georgie needed him. Missy needed him. The family needed him. And George kept showing up again and again. He sacrificed career opportunities. He supported his children. He protected his family. He tried to keep his marriage together. He carried responsibilities that often seemed impossible. And when he needed somewhere to escape, he found it in a beer, a television, a backyard, or a quiet moment where nobody was asking him to solve another problem. Maybe that is the real tragedy of George Cooper. He wasn't the father who didn't care. He was the father who cared so much that everyone assumed he would always be okay. And sometimes, the strongest person in the family is the one nobody thinks to check on. George spent his entire life making sure his family never felt alone. But in the end, he was the one who had spent years feeling that way.